Hello everyone and welcome to Chapter 6. Chapter 6 looks at language and intercultural communication. More specifically, we're going to talk about some of the different types of aspects of language that influence things like pronunciation and how we deliver speech. We're also going to look at issues related to bilingualism and multilingualism, and we're also going to discuss some language policies and how those shape communication. And in addition, we're going to talk about the ways in which people strategically use language to mark identity and to create in-group cohesion and things like that. So let's get started. So when we think about different types of languages, there are various categories that we tend to organize speech and language into. So one of these categories in terms of language would be standardized languages. And the standardized language of any kind of policy or a standardized language for a nation or a state would be the official languages that tend to occupy communication in terms of public discourse. Also, standardized languages tend to be the language that is on paperwork for official government documents. These are the languages that tend to be used during educational or more mainstream political or media dialogue. And so standardized languages are basically just the official language that has been designated for a given nation or a given state. So for example, in the United States, one of our standard languages or our standard language is English, right? But if you go to Germany, clearly their standard language or their official language is German. And of course, Spanish is a very widely spoken language all over the world. And so there are many different countries that have Spanish as their official language. However, when we're thinking about non-standard languages, we can talk about things like pidgins or Creole languages. And a pidgin language is basically the merging of two or more languages in terms of the words they use, the ways that things are pronounced, things like that. And what ends up happening is you actually end up having a new language that ends up emerging based on the mixing of two languages. So for example, we can look at the origin of Hawaiian Pidgin nowadays, and we can see that over the years in the state of Hawaii, that Hawaiian Pidgin has become really the language of choice for most people who live in the Hawaiian Islands. And actually, although the name of Hawaiian Pidgin is Pidgin, and I use the word pidgin to refer to this language in my lectures because this is the term that multi-ethnic locals or Hawaiian locals in the state of Hawaii use to refer to pidgin. So I also use the same term, pidgin, to refer to Hawaiian Pidgin. But actually, what we know as Hawaiian Pidgin today is actually a Creole language. And so the difference between Pidgin and Creole languages is that a Pidgin language is basically the first generation of people who are taught to speak a certain language. Those people are speaking a Pidgin language. So for example, when all of the immigrants came over to the Hawaiian Islands, about 200 years ago to work on the plantations, there were many people from many different nations that came there. So you had Hawaiians that lived there. You also had Caucasian Americans that had relocated that were doing work in politics and economy and things like that, and military, right? But you also had people that moved to the Hawaiian Islands from places like the Philippines or places like Japan or Korea or Portugal or China. And so what ended up happening with many of these people that moved to Hawaii for relocation and for work, most of them came over to work on the plantations, right? What ended up happening is they show up in Hawaii and they start their jobs and they realize that they all speak a different language. So the Pidgin language, the Hawaiian Pidgin language that we now have today in the state of Hawaii is actually a combination of all of these different types of languages from these different nations, including English being thrown in there. And they use words from all of these different types of languages. And because everybody had to figure out a way to communicate, they were able to merge all of the languages that were being spoken into one common language where everyone could understand what was being said and what was being referred to and things like that. So for clarification purposes, the difference between Pidgin and Creole languages is that a language is only a Pidgin language when it is the first generation of people who are learning that language. So let's say you were to learn a new language that had lots of different languages merging, that would be a Pidgin language that you had learned. However, as soon as you have children, or as soon as the next generation of speakers takes on the same language, at that point the language changes from a Pidgin to an actual Creole language. And so these different terms are used to talk about language and language difference and language categories because linguists like to find a way to mark the development of different language categories. And so this is one of the ways that they have delineated or distinguished the difference between Pidgin and Creole languages. And if you ever have an opportunity to go to the Hawaiian Islands, I guarantee you that you will hear Hawaiian Pidgin being spoken. And for some folks, it's very challenging to figure out what is being said. But I can guarantee you that after you hang out there for a while and get to talk to people, you would also start to figure out what was being said, and you might also pick up the Pidgin language yourself. There are several components of language, and we're going to go through these one by one. The first component of language structure and meaning is semantics. And semantics deals with the words that we use to refer to different ideas and the meanings that we assign to those words. And as you may know, a lot of times people might use different words to refer to the same thing or the same words to refer to different things. And of course, these kinds of issues can cause communication misunderstandings sometimes. But we can look at various examples of semantics and how they might influence our meanings and the meanings that we assign. So for example, those of you that have traveled to the United Kingdom probably are aware of the fact that over there they refer to the trunk of a car by calling it the boot. However, here in the US, we tend to refer to the trunk of a car by calling it the trunk. So you can understand how this could potentially cause some misunderstandings or confusion. Let's say that you go to visit your friend in the UK and they say, okay, well, why don't you put your suitcase in the boot? And you stop and stare at them like, how do I fit this suitcase into my boot? That's impossible, right? So even just very simple word differences like this can cause confusion and misunderstanding, but it also contributes to a unique way of looking at the world as well. And so it's definitely worth paying attention to some of these semantic differences and how people assign meanings differently based on the cultural orientation with which they are used to. We can also look at things like syntax or syntactics. And syntax deals with things like structure and grammar. So those of you who have learned a different language other than English, you're probably aware of the fact that one of the things that is challenging about language acquisition or new language or second language acquisition is the structure and the grammar of where you place words in the order of a sentence, right? So these are some of the things that tend to make learning a new language more challenging. However, it's also something that makes it more interesting, right? So we can think about language in terms of semantics or words. We can also think about language in terms of syntax or the order and structure of sentences and how we organize words in sentences. Another way that we can understand language would be by looking at pragmatics. Pragmatics deals with how meaning is constructed or how we assign meaning based upon things like relationships that we have, contexts that we have, the tone that people use. And what's interesting about pragmatics is that it looks a lot at the contextual differences surrounding us in a given communication interaction. And it looks at the ways in which people derive meaning of words primarily based on context and relationship and how interpretation is shaped by these things. So for example, most of the time when we have closer friendships or relationships, we have different types of memories, right? We create memories together And sometimes you might have a very favorite story or a specific story that you like to retell over and over again. Maybe this is a story that talks about your adventures trying to figure out where the train system was in a new city or things like that. And so what's interesting about pragmatics is that if you're talking with, let's say, old friends of yours who actually went on a trip with you and you went through an adventure trying to find the transportation system or the train system in a new country, it might only take that one word, train, to jog everybody's memory, right? People might start laughing because it was such a hilarious adventure that you'll never forget. And so if we were to take a situation like that and we just use the word train, okay, the word train would symbolize much more than just a train to the people that had that experience together, right? The people that were involved in those relationships would have a very different interpretation of the word train, especially if it was spoken in the same group of people that were, in that location going through the adventure, right? So we can look at the way in which words derive meaning based on context issues, and pragmatics is an area of language that looks at that. And finally, we can look at phonetics. Phonetics is very interesting because it looks at the different types of sounds or pronunciations that we use to speak different languages. So I know that for some people who are trying to learn, let's say, German or Spanish, they may struggle with acquiring the different types of pronunciation norms that are a part of that language, right? So we happen to know, for example, that in German, there is sometimes a glottal sound that is quite common, right? So if I was going to say, my name is Mika, I would say, let's see. I could say informally, I could say, ich bin Mika, right? I am Mika, right? And so that ich sound is a very kind of glottal throat sound that we don't tend to use a lot in English. Similarly, in the Spanish language, you'll find a lot of the rolling of the tongue, right? So you're expected to roll the tongue in order to pronounce certain words effectively. And people sometimes struggle with pronouncing these things, and of course they struggle with sometimes being understood in a second language because it's difficult for folks to pronounce sounds that are unfamiliar to them. And so it's a very interesting aspect of language use, and I think it's worth paying attention to. With regards to acquiring a new language, if you yourself were interested in learning a new language, or if you wanted to raise your children so that they were bilingual or trilingual, the general rule for language acquisition and language learning is that it's very good to start your children or start a new language by the time you're age 5. It's ideal if you can actually start teaching someone a new language or a second language around 3 or 4. And obviously you would also want to be speaking the language around them when they were an infant as well, because all of these different sounds become a part of people's mental blueprints for language and syntax and things like that, right? So anyway, the rule on language is basically if you do want to have someone acquire a language so that they are very proficient and they can speak it naturally without many markers like accents and things like that, you want to start people on learning a new language as early as possible, preferably when they're a young child. However, I have met people who have not learned new languages until like 10 or 12, and those people sometimes can learn to speak a language without any kind of marker or accent. So for example, my father, who is from Germany, he did not come over to the United States until he was about 10 or 12, but because he worked so hard at speaking English proficiently, and he didn't speak any German for many, many years while he was assimilating to the USA, he has very, very few markers of his German accent. Every once in a while, I can hear a marker that's very, very slight, but I think I only hear it because I study language and because I know my dad and things like that. But anyway, it's a very interesting aspect of language, and I think that learning a language is definitely an adventure that fewer people maybe in the United States end up doing. But if you go to places in Europe, for example, I was in Europe one year when I was back in grad school, and my mom and I took the train up to Norway from Italy, and so it was quite a long train ride. And what I discovered on the train going up to Norway is that the gentleman who was basically the concierge, sort of customer service waiter, you know, he would basically take care of all of your needs on the train, because we were staying in a sleeper train. And I asked him, because I was, you know, obviously studying language back then, because I was in graduate school still. And I asked him, well, how many languages do you speak? Because he spoke English very well. And so I said, well, how many languages do you speak? You speak English so well. And he had said to me that he speaks English. I think his native language was Swiss. He also spoke Italian. He spoke German. He spoke French. He spoke, I believe, Norwegian, right? He spoke a few other languages even. And it was just fascinating to me that one person would be proficient at speaking 7 or 8 different languages. But what you tend to find if you go to places like Europe, or even if you go to places like India, there are so many different dialects of language in places like India that people oftentimes will speak many different dialects, or in the case of Europe, they speak many different languages. What's also very interesting about language use is that depending on where you are in a country, there will be different dialects or different types of language that are being spoken. So for example, if you go to Germany and you go to more of the northern region of Germany, or the middle or northern regions like in Berlin or something, you'll hear people speaking what's been called Hochdeutsch, which is interpreted, it means high German or proper German. And so if you were to try to compare that to English, that would basically be the difference between speaking formal, colloquial, standard English, like in a classroom, versus speaking more like slang or like Southern accented English, or really informal English. So if you go to a place like Berlin, you'll notice that people tend to speak a certain type of very formal Hochdeutsch. But where my family currently lives in Germany, they live in the southern German region, and it's called Schwabia, where they live. And down in Schwabia, they don't speak Hochdeutsch. They speak a very different type of German, and it's almost a little bit closer to French. And it has a lot less of the more formal markers than Hochdeutsch. And I remember when my dad went over to Germany a few years ago, he had actually been studying Hochdeutsch at the university, okay? And so he had taken a German class where he had refreshed his German. And he went to go to Germany, and he expected that he would be able to communicate very easily with his relatives, because he had been studying German. And when he got there, what he found was that they began to look at him kind of strangely, because he was speaking Hochdeutsch, which is basically classroom, colloquial, formal German. And our relatives don't speak that dialect. They don't speak that form of German. They speak a different form that's much more laid back and much more relaxed, right? And so they would say, and then when he would travel, like when he would go around the region and go on little trips on his own, he would talk to people in German, and they would say things to him like, "Are you from France? You know, are you French?" You know, and so they would think that he was French because he spoke a different dialect than the people that they were used to. So even when you're speaking technically the same language, there are so many different types of language markers that give people cues about where you're from, what your identity is, and even if it's not accurate, people will make a whole host of assumptions about other people based on the language that they speak and how they deliver that speech. So language is definitely an important part of intercultural communication, and it's worth considering the various aspects of language that you yourself perform on a regular basis. I'm sure that you're aware of the fact that if you are in a classroom, most of you are doing your best to speak colloquial standard English. However, if you're speaking with your friends back home, or maybe with your grandparents or whatever, you might try to be a little more informal. So these are very interesting aspects of language, and I encourage you to consider the ways that speech shape your own experience of the world, and also the way that you view other people in the world. Language and identity. As I've been talking about in this lecture already, language use tends to reflect identity, and people actually derive identity from their language as well. So here in the US, we speak certain types of language dialects. We have different types of accents that we might have. There may be a Southern accent that people have. There might be an Eastern accent from the Eastern region of the USA. And there might be the use of more Valley speech from people who are from California, right? And Valley speech tends to be characterized by the use of more powerless language, using hedge words like, you know, tag questions at the end of statements, things like that. And so it's important to consider the ways in which our speech shapes our identity and also the ways in which it shapes how we view other people, right? The speech that other people use. So we can look at, for example, the prevalence of English in the US, but we can also look at the fact that there are many people in the USA today that do not speak the English language on a regular basis. And in fact, their primary language use might be a different language, right? We know, for example, that Spanish is the most frequently spoken language in the United States right now, other than English, right? And so there are lots of implications for the rest of us maybe who don't even speak a different language in terms of effective communication, in terms of being able to relate to other people who have diverse systems of communication than ourselves, right? And it's worth considering the ways in which hearing other languages influences your perceptions of other people. Some of the research that I have done in the past deals with perceptions of language and how we make assumptions about people based on what language they speak and how often they speak it and things like that. And there are certain types of assumptions about what people should do when they, let's say, assimilate or immigrate to countries. One of the issues that we're going to talk about in a few moments here are language policies and the reasons behind developing language policies. But language is definitely a marker of identity, and it can also mark your identity if you travel to other places in the world as well. Generally speaking, if you do go to another country, it is usually a good idea to do your best to try to learn a little bit of the language, even if you cannot speak it proficiently. The reason for this is that there are certain types of words that you probably want to be able to speak in another language so that you can find things when you need to find them. And this is one of the reasons why they sell tour guide books or, you know, travel books that have like the most important phrases you're ever going to need, right? So like you can go and, you know, find a translation book and it'll tell you how to say something like, where is the restaurant, or where is the doctor, or where is the bathroom, right? These are things that you would definitely want to be prepared to communicate about if you were to go to another country. Although it's true that in many countries nowadays, especially in the larger cities, there are many people who speak English, it's never a good idea just to assume that when you get somewhere, everybody will be speaking English, okay? And I've had experiences like this where I didn't really think, I was younger, so I didn't really think much about it, but you might have a lot of people who speak English in the city, but you may not always be in the city. And so you might find yourself in the suburbs in Italy trying to find your hotel one day and not being able to speak any of the Italian language when you're getting help from people that are living in the suburbs that maybe don't know English very well. It can definitely be a disadvantage. So I strongly encourage you to consider either acquiring some of the language before you go abroad, or at the very least, you would want to bring a phrase book or some kind of a technology device that would allow you to be able to say the phrases that you know you probably want to be able to do, okay? So definitely something to think about and to file away for later. And of course, another reason for attempting to speak another language when you go abroad to a different country is because it says something to the people that you're speaking with, right? If I go to another country and I assume that everybody is going to speak my language, right? They may not feel as if I am that interested in learning about their culture. So if I go to another country and I am trying to speak the language, I might not be very good at it. But what you tend to find, and what I have found, in my travels abroad is that generally speaking, people try to help you, and they will be happy that you're at least trying to speak their language, rather than just asking if they speak English, right? So, and a lot of times they might even switch into English. If you try to speak their language, they might realize the level of understanding you have in their language, and they will do you a favor and transition into English, and then you can, of course, understand much easier. But I generally think it's a very good principle to go by, that, when in Rome, do as the Romans, right? And so when in Italy, try to speak Italian. When in Germany, at least try to speak German, and it's just a way of showing respect and appreciation to the host culture in which we're visiting. And it's also a way to foster more harmonious intercultural relationships, because showing people that you are trying to communicate in their language is really a way of showing respect to people that you are visiting in their home country. So it's definitely something worth considering. And as we've already been discussing, language does connect us to various group memberships. We know who we are based on the languages that we speak. And in many languages, there are certain types of phrases or terms that do not translate very well into other languages. And so these are all things that are worth considering with regards to our own speech, whether you decide to ever learn another language, how you view other people who have immigrated to the United States and are attempting to speak English, and maybe they're struggling, right? One thing that I can tell you from my own experiences trying to learn other languages is that it is not easy to learn another language, especially when you are an adult. And so it really creates a lot of empathy in you when you learn another language or try to, because when you try to learn a language and you realize how difficult it is, then you have a lot more empathy and sensitivity towards people who have immigrated to the United States and who are attempting to speak English, even if they have a heavy accent or if they don't get the order, the grammar correctly and things like that. Okay, so definitely worth considering. But we can also think about language and how it links us to various types of group memberships or affiliations. So we have certain types of phrases or terms that we use exclusively with our romantic partner, right? And if we were to use those terms with people at work, it obviously would not be appropriate, right? So sometimes in romantic relationships, people may have, little pet names for each other, like they would call each other, honey and sweetie or something like that. And so if you go to work and you call your, you talk to your coworker and you refer them as honey in the hallway, all right, that generally is not seen as a very appropriate type of speech to be using in the workplace, right? So it's very interesting how language tends to affiliate us with different group memberships. It tends to mark relationships and levels of intimacy in relationships. And it also tends to create a sense of cohesion and in-group identity. And language also can mark out-group identity, or those people that do not belong to our group. So these are all things that are definitely worth considering. Moving between languages. Bilingualism is the ability to proficiently speak and understand 2 or more languages, okay? And multilingualism deals with people that speak 3 or more languages. Now, I don't know about you, but for many of us, effectively speaking just one language is oftentimes enough of a challenge, right? Especially considering that we adapt our speech depending on who we're communicating with and depending on whether we're in front of a group of people or whether we're informally talking with some friends, right? But in many nations of the world, most people do speak more than one language. And I did talk about this already in this PowerPoint presentation, so I'm not going to discuss it too much, but it is worth considering the benefits that multilingualism or bilingualism does allow people to have. And there are many nations actually that have multilingual official languages. So for example, Belgium has 3 languages that are listed as the standard or official language. These include Dutch, German, and French. In Switzerland, you have French, German, and Italian, and obviously Swiss, right? So there are many different nations that do not only have one language as their official language, but they might have 2 or 3 or even more languages. And so this says something about the multicultural world that we live in. And also, it also says something about the fact that the immigration trends today are very, very prevalent. And in fact, if you've been following the news, you've been probably watching about many immigrants that are currently moving into Europe from other nations of the world that are having political and economic problems. And so these immigration issues tend to bring the language issues more to the forefront of discussion and management, right? So, for example, I know that in Germany, there have been, for the last 20, 30, 40 years, there have been many people from Turkey immigrating into Germany so that they can access educational and career and work advantages. But what the German government is finding is that many of these immigrants are living in cultural enclaves or in neighborhoods or areas of the cities or country where they are fairly insulated in their own communities with other Turkish people. And so what that means then is that many people who are born in Germany nowadays may not even be actually learning German. They may just continue speaking Turkish. They may speak a Turkish-German pidgin mix. I've heard of this happening as well. And so there are very real concerns for people who are in government and political positions, because one thing that we know about effective multicultural communication is that people need to be able to understand each other. And so when you have systems of education or systems of employment or systems of government or media systems, and you have people who speak many different languages, there has to be a way to mainstream or streamline communication so that people can understand what information needs to be acquired. And so these are some of the issues that are currently ongoing in many nations of the world. The US is just one nation that has been dealing with this issue as well, but it's definitely something to consider and definitely influences the impressions that people have about immigrants and about people of different cultural groups. And it certainly influences our ability to effectively communicate with people who have a different speech style or language than us, right? So good to consider these things. There are many reasons why people may code switch, and code switching is defined as switching between two or more languages or speech styles within a given sentence or conversation. And so some of the reasons for code switching could include things like accommodating speech. So for example, when I was in Italy with my mom one summer, I had tried to learn a little bit of Italian. However, I was not very good at it. I will admit it. But what I found is that people are very accommodating when they see you trying to speak their language. So what I would find myself doing is I would go up to someone and I would, ask them in Italian where something was, like, do you know where the bagno is, or mangiare, which is to eat or whatever. And as soon as they realized that you spoke English, what they would do is they would accommodate your speech and they would switch into English if they knew it, right? So this is a way of accommodating communication so that we can have more effective communication. We also use accommodation when we are communicating with people in America as well, though, right? So we adapt our speech based on what is to be expected in terms of appropriate speech, and this can also be seen as a type of accommodation. We may also code switch in order to avoid accommodation. So perhaps we do not want to conform in a given situation, and we want to speak a different language to mark identity, to demonstrate our unique culture. We may just want to communicate in the language that is more familiar to us or that we feel more comfortable speaking in. These are reasons why people may not choose to speak a certain language in a given interaction. And finally, we may decide that we want to switch into other language styles in order to express different aspects of our cultural identity. So for instance, when I go back to the Hawaiian Islands, sometimes I will speak a little bit of Hawaiian Pidgin if it seems appropriate in a certain context, because I am from the Hawaiian Islands. I grew up hearing Hawaiian Pidgin, and it is the language of choice for most people who live there. And so given that I understand that, it's something that tends to be a part of my cultural identity that I can choose to switch on and off depending on whether it's appropriate for me to speak it or not. Now, if I was going to come into a classroom at the university, I certainly would not be speaking Hawaiian Pidgin in front of the class because it is not considered to be a formal standardized speech style. And there are different ideas about what's considered to be appropriate in the classroom, but it is useful to be able to accommodate different communication cultures when you decide you need to or want to. And so that would be a reason for considering learning another language, perhaps going to other countries so that you would be able to practice that language. And hopefully when you have the ability to speak a language every day, such as you would when you live in a certain nation, that would allow you to pick up a language so that you actually could speak it proficiently and perhaps with somewhat of a natural flow, right? So these are things to think about in terms of why people might choose to switch into one language versus the other. As I mentioned a few moments ago, there are many language policies that tend to guide communication in every nation. And so the goal of language policies basically are to regulate communication among people, right? And I talked about this a few slides ago about the way in which we have to figure out a common way to communicate so that people of different backgrounds can come together and understand each other. And so language policies deal with the laws and customs that are enacted, which mandate which languages we should speak, when we should speak them, and where it is considered appropriate to speak a certain language over others. It may be interesting for you to find out that in New Mexico, there are actually 2 official languages, Spanish and English. In addition, Hawaiian is also an official language in Hawaii, and also English is an official language in Hawaii. Now, the Hawaiian language was not reinstated as an official language in the Hawaiian Islands until the 1980s. I believe it was 1986. And actually, Hawaiian was outlawed in the Hawaiian Islands during the period of annexation, and when the U.S. became a part of, when Hawaii became a part of the U.S. And Hawaii actually became outlawed even before that. And so it was actually illegal for Hawaiians to speak the Hawaiian language in schools or in government or in public and things like that. And this is one type of restrictive law that sometimes gets put into place to attempt to regulate communication. However, if you think about the impact that this had on the Hawaiian people, it clearly was not good. And in fact, right before the Hawaiian language was reinstated in 1986, the 1970s, and like the late 1970s, probably around 1978, there was what has been now labeled a Hawaiian cultural revolution or renaissance period, where the Hawaiian language, Hawaiian dance, Hawaiian music became much more important. And actually this developed as a result of the recognition that many Hawaiian scholars and educators had that the Hawaiian language was becoming extinct because nobody was speaking it anymore. So we can look at policies and language policies, and it's always really important to consider the ways in which these kinds of formal language issues can shape cultural preservation, whether people are able to know and experience their culture, and the ways in which these types of policies can actually shape the long-term trajectory of culture and cultural preservation, sometimes in ways that people don't even anticipate, right? So language politics and policies is an important issue globally. It's becoming more and more important considering the global migration of so many people right now. And I expect that this is going to be one of the leading issues in the next couple hundred years as all of these nations of the world attempt to figure out a way to manage communication effectively when you have people living in your nation from all over the globe. As I discussed a few slides ago, there are various goals for language policies, and many people who are in leadership positions in the government and in politics and in education and things like that are charged, or they're expected to manage the various types of languages that exist in a given language or community. So one of the goals of language policies is to encourage assimilation among newer members of a society. So in this case, we're looking at, let's say, the United States of America. We're looking at immigrants that are coming to the U.S. There is an expectation that when people get to the United States that they will try to learn English, or that they will do their best to acquire English as soon as possible. This is one idea that goes along with the melting pot philosophy, which is that you will basically merge into the larger, more dominant U.S. culture, right? And sometimes at the expense of your own language and culture. But we can also see that this is a situation in Germany as well. And a few slides ago, I did mention the ongoing dialogue that is happening in the government in Germany with regards to managing the influx of what used to be Turkish immigrants, but now we're having lots of other immigrants that are coming into Germany as well. So lots of people coming up from Syria, from Africa, places like that. So it's a very interesting idea to think about, especially at this point in global history when we see that there is more global immigration happening than probably any period in the history of civilization. Language policies also are enacted in order to protect indigenous languages from extinction. So, for example, a few slides ago, I gave the example of how Hawaiian in the state of Hawaii was reestablished as an official language in order to protect the language. Once the language was reestablished as an official language, then it was a language that could be used in education, it could be used in politics, it could be used for teaching purposes and for community gatherings and things like that. And so this is one of the ways that the government seeks to try to protect cultural identity in a world that seems to have a prevalence of English. And of course, the result of the globalization of the English language is that there are many authentic and indigenous cultures all over the world that are losing their languages at a very rapid rate, because most of the young people your age and my age, or younger even, are choosing to speak English, right? Because English is the language that they see on television, in films, in the media, right? English is the language of commerce. English is the language of education, even in some nations, right? Even if there is a different official language, a lot of nations will have English instruction as well. So this is an issue that is very important. It's definitely worth considering. And I'm certain that if you think about living in a world where there is only a couple of languages, it seems like it would be a very bland place to live. And certainly I definitely love the English language. I also like the German language. I like Spanish. I like the Italian language because it's so melodic and beautiful. And, there's just something very beautiful about all the diversity that we see inherent in the actual speech of different languages. But more important than that is the cultural identity that languages allow people to preserve through the use of that language. In addition, language policies regulate language use in terms of which languages people should speak, where, and when. So, for example, there tends to be an English-only formal policy in most work environments here in the USA. Informally, people often speak different languages, right? If you work at any number of types of companies or any number of types of industries, you probably already know that there are many different languages being spoken in U.S. Employment offices or U.S. work organizations. However, the formal policy is one of English only. Primarily, this is so that people can communicate effectively and so there are not misunderstandings or miscommunication. Because as we know, in certain types of industries, if people are miscommunicating, these types of misunderstandings can have very dire consequences for safety in some cases, right? So these are some of the goals of language policies, and they are very important in terms of managing nations, especially in the modern world, where we do see lots and lots of people living from different countries in the same place or in the same country. In the next few slides, as we start to wrap up this lecture, I'm going to go through 3 different theories that were developed that help us to understand the reasons why people speak in the way that they speak. We're also going to look at a few theories that predict different types of things we can look for in terms of whether a language will survive. And we're also going to look at the ways that people use speech to mark in-group solidarity and to differentiate who belongs to the in-group and who does not. So the first theory we're going to talk about is ethno-linguistic vitality theory, or EVT. This was developed by Howard Giles and colleagues. I have worked very closely with Professor Howard Giles over the last decade or so because he was my PhD advisor. So we have published numerous articles together, and he is an expert in the area of sociolinguistics and communication studies. And so this is a theory that looks at the different ways that we can look at language survival, or the likelihood that languages will survive the test of time. And so I'm going to go through each of these theories one by one. The next theory that we will be talking about in the next few minutes is called communication accommodation theory, or CAT. This was also developed by Howard Giles and colleagues. And then finally, we will also be talking about a theory that was developed by a woman named Carol Myers-Scotton. And this theory is called the markedness model. And this theory allows us to understand why it is that people speak in certain languages in different situations, and how it is that people understand whether they should speak a certain language or not. So let's get into each of these before we wrap up this chapter. According to ethno-linguistic vitality theory, we can look at languages and the likelihood about whether they will survive or not based on 2 types of vitality. These are objective, or OBJ, objective vitality, and subjective vitality, or SUBJ, okay? So we can look at the combined influence of objective vitality and subjective vitality to gauge whether a language will survive over time or not. Now, objective vitality deals with things that can be measured objectively. So things like the number of speakers that currently speak that language, and how often the language is used in politics, institutions, education, and the media. However, in comparison, subjective vitality deals with the personal value that different speakers of a language assign to a certain language, okay? So how much status do I assign to, let's say, the language that I was raised speaking, okay? How much do I think it is a useful language for me to know? Subjective vitality also looks at the feelings or the attitudes that people have towards a given language. And based on these combined factors, Howard Giles and colleagues have theorized or hypothesized that you can gauge whether a language will continue or survive or not. So drawing on the examples that I provided previously, when we look at things like the objective vitality of the Hawaiian language, for example, we know, for example, that the objective vitality since the language was reinstated as an official language in the state of Hawaii, the objective vitality in terms of number of speakers has definitely increased. When the Hawaiian language was first beginning to be revitalized, there were an estimated fewer than about 200 or 300 speakers of the language that were still living in the state. And as we know, when the people who speak an indigenous language die or pass on, if they have not passed on that language to people who are younger that can also speak the language and pass it on to the next generation, that language and the information about that language tends to disappear as well. So we can look at the objective vitality of the Hawaiian language, and nowadays there are thousands of speakers of the Hawaiian language living in the state of Hawaii, and so we know that the objective vitality has increased. We also know, for example, that the language is being used more in politics, It's also being used more in terms of education because there are a lot of Hawaiian immersion language education schools that have opened in the last 10 or 20 years to promote the survival of the Hawaiian language. We can also look at things like how the language is used in media. And for example, there are different types of radio stations that tend to have Hawaiian music shows where they only speak in the Hawaiian language. And so these are ways that we can gauge things like objective vitality and how likely it is a language will survive in the future. We can also look at things like the subjective vitality, or how people in Hawaii view the language. And so one of the issues that some Hawaiians have dealt with in the past is feeling as if they shouldn't be speaking their language because it was outlawed, and many Hawaiian children during this period when the language was outlawed, many Hawaiian children would go to schools where they were punished for speaking the Hawaiian language. So it took years for the attitudes that many Hawaiians had about the language to change, right? And so because of these social historical factors, sometimes the feelings or the attitudes that people have towards a given language can also be influenced by those things. But the good thing is that attitudes and feelings are also subject to change depending on the experiences we have in life. And so nowadays, the research has shown that many of the younger Hawaiian children who are learning the Hawaiian language and culture from basically, when they're a toddler on up, many of those children and adults, right, because they've been having these immersion schools for the last 15, 20 years, many of them have a very positive attitude or feeling about the Hawaiian language and about the utility of the language in Hawaii. So ethno-linguistic vitality theory is a useful theory for understanding language survival, and the theory has been used in hundreds of studies since it's been developed. And there are lots of studies. If you were interested in looking up this issue more, you would probably be able to find this theory being applied to many different languages all over the world. Communication accommodation theory looks at the ways in which we verbally and non-verbally accommodate communication in order to establish in-group solidarity, cohesion, things like that. But we might also speak in a different way in order to mark difference or distinguish ourselves from other people. So, for example, convergence deals with speaking similarly or adapting our nonverbal cues so that our nonverbal cues are also more similar to other people's. So I might, for example, switch into a language that is more comfortable to somebody else because I know how to speak it. So for example, if I can speak German and I have relatives that are visiting from Germany, I might choose to speak German with them rather than having them speak English, simply because it's easier for them to communicate in German. We might also converge in terms of things like other language markers. So you might speak more professionally when you're at work because your boss speaks in a more professional manner, and you would probably speak more informally or using slang with your friends. Those are different types of verbal convergence behaviors. We also sometimes tend to converge non-verbally. So you might notice sometimes that you have a friend who uses their hands a lot to talk and communicate, right? They're always gesturing with their hands. So you might notice after hanging out with them that you start to use your hands more, right? So that's a type of nonverbal convergence. Divergence behaviors, on the other hand, tend to mark difference or tend to include when we speak differently than somebody else. Sometimes divergence behaviors convey distance and exclusion. So for example, if you have a group of friends and they all tend to be good at speaking, let's say, Italian, and let's say you walk into the room and they're all speaking in English, and then they switch into Italian, right, which is a language that you don't understand or know how to speak, I'm pretty sure that most people in that situation would feel that they were being excluded from a conversation, right? So divergence behaviors can be used sometimes to distance ourselves from people, to mark a difference or exclude people. A lot of times these things and these behaviors may not even be conscious. People may be just doing these things unconsciously, but it's definitely worth considering in terms of our own behaviors, how we communicate, and of course, the way in which other people communicate, and how these factors tend to interact in terms of effective intercultural communication. Now, sometimes we might not change our speech or our communication style at all. And in these cases, we are maintaining communication. So if I continue to speak the same language in the same manner, and I continue to use the same nonverbal cues, that would be a good case or a good clear example of maintenance behaviors, which is basically not changing our speech style at all. The last theory that we're going to talk about in this lecture is the markedness model. And the markedness model allows us to understand how it is that people try or strive to speak a language that is considered to be appropriate or unmarked whenever possible. So when people tend to speak a language that is considered to be marked, they often become stigmatized or they become noticed, right? So for example, let's say that you're having a conversation with a group of friends, and one of your friends is from another country, and your friend is attempting to speak the English language, but they have a very heavy accent, and they may be very difficult to understand at times. According to the markedness model, that person, although they are attempting to adapt to the English language, that person would be speaking a marked language because it is something that caused them to be noticed, right? They were noticed as different than the rest of the group. Another example we could think about would be the use of cuss words or very heavy slang words, right? So for some of us who tend to spend a lot of time at the university, a lot of the language that we tend to hear being used, especially in formal communication interactions, is more standardized colloquial English. So you might find yourself in situations sometimes maybe with people that are not as used to speaking more formal English, and they may speak with heavy slang, they may use a lot of cuss words, they just might use different communication norms than you might be used to, right? So if you are communicating with someone and you have, let's say, a group of friends and you all speak in a certain way, and one person speaks with very, very heavy slang, or they use speech that is not the normal speech that you tend to use in your group of friends, that person would then also become marked because they're speaking in a different variety. And in a lot of cases, difference can mean that people are stigmatized, right? Now, in some cases, the different variety might be something that actually gives somebody some status. So, for example, the British accent tends to be an accent that many people tend to think sounds really cool. It tends to be a fairly high status accent. When you ask people, what are is there like a hierarchy of accents in terms of, the value that you assign to certain language accents or certain speech accents? The British accent, a German accent, all of these tend to have more of a higher status than some other language accents, right? So these are various ways that we can think about whether the language that people speak is something that grants them access to a community, or whether it's something that marks them and actually might set them up for social issues or social challenges in a community. According to Myers-Scotton, the language norms that guide communication are also very context specific. So using our previous example about colloquial speech at the university, although you might be expected to speak in a standard format when you're in front of your class giving a public speech or when you're speaking in public, the norm in terms of communication with your friends might be a lot less formal, right? So if you were to take colloquial formal English and use that speech style with your friends, they might stop and look at you and ask you, what are you doing? Like, why are you speaking that way? Are you trying to act all professional, or what are you doing? Why are you talking that way with us, right? It would be something that would be very context specific. And if you violate the expectation in a different context, right, So the expectation with your friends would be more informal speech, right? And so when you're communicating with your friends, if you were to violate that expectation of informal speech, then you would be marked in that situation. However, adapting to the colloquial speech in the university setting is considered to be appropriate, right? So you can see how context guides what is considered to be a marked speech style or not. A final topic that the Markedist model talks about is the fact that people tend to vary in their ability to assess what they should be speaking or assess what language or what speech style they should use. And people also vary in their ability to speak these certain languages. So although an immigrant to the United States of America may be able to assess that they are supposed to speak standard English at the university, their ability to perform standard English or to speak standard English correctly may be hindered by several factors, many of which we talked about in this lecture, right? We have syntax issue, we have phonetics, we have grammar. So many of those issues may actually make it a challenge for them to speak standard English effectively. And in those kinds of cases, the markedness model would suggest that somebody who is struggling to speak English or to be understood when they do speak English would also be considered to be marked. So hopefully this lecture has provided you with several important ideas about language and language attitudes and language use. I am hoping that you were able to learn some information that is going to be useful for you, both in terms of your communication interactions here in the U.S. and also when you tend to travel or go outside of this region or outside of the United States. Generally speaking, it's always just a good thing to consider that we all want to be treated with respect and dignity. So whether you are the person who is a new immigrant to another country or whether you're studying abroad for 6 months and you are a new person, or whether you are talking to someone who has just immigrated to the United States, generally speaking, just showing kindness and respect really will go a long ways, even if you don't actually speak the same language or even if you don't exactly understand what someone is saying, because the language of kindness is universal, right? And a lot of times we can communicate things non-verbally, such as a smile or a handshake or a friendly gesture or things like that, that can convey meaning even if we don't have the right words for it. So I'm going to leave you on that note. I hope that you all got something useful from this lecture, and I will talk to you in the next chapter. Thank you for your time.